The work that we're situating today around is with an article that came out, what was it, year and a half ago, Cecile and Stephanie, which is With Privilege Comes Responsibility. This is a work that had profound influence on us and actually was also very generative at a time where we were creating our own systems thinking framework around called the Marionette. And they were specifically asking questions about agency that were deeply, deeply resonant with us. And in fact, and some of you may have seen the posts that I had shared on LinkedIn, some of the questions that were asked in this article were questions that I had been asking myself in my own career at various times in organizational life, which is why do some privileged insiders engage in pro-social institutional change? Um, Transforming organizations or attempting to transform organizations while others do not, and having that space of not necessarily of judgment, but trying to ask the question, why do people engage in this kind of work, and why do others choose not to? And what they found, which we'll get a chance to talk a lot about today, which was that it relates a lot of what happens around people utilizing these different degrees of agency have to do with recognizing their own complicity, and specifically the relationship that they have into the felt states around complicity and the way the felt states and emotions actually become generative towards organizational disruption or change. So we're going to talk about those journeys that they revealed through some of the research subjects that they studied. And so I will stop talking about your work and let you talk about your work, but I'll just introduce Cecile and Stephanie. Cecile Feront is a senior lecturer and director of the postgraduate diploma in development finance at UCT Graduate School of Business, a research fellow at the Stellenbosch University Center for Sustainable Transitions, and also involved with the Embedding Project. Dr. Stephanie Bertels is the Van Dusen Professor of Sustainability at SFU, Speedy School of Business, and the lead on the Embedding Project. Steph and I have known each other for 13 years or so, and I've been hugely influenced by her work, and it's been amazing to connect with Cecile and invite you both to bring your voice into the space.
Well,
Do you want
thank
to
you so much.
introduce yourself in some way? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, feel very privileged to be here tonight. So thank you so much for the invitation, Adam and Anthony and Anna. I look forward to this discussion. I think I mean, we did the research because we felt it was important, but I think especially in the context of the polycrisis that we face, the question of responsibility, the discussion around privilege and responsibility feels quite important.
Yeah, and same, delighted to be here, really excited for the conversation, and yeah, just looking forward to getting started.
Thank you. Anna?
Yeah, I'm super excited to have this conversation. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good to see some new faces here. So the question kind of underneath this whole series of organizational mazes is touching on stuckness, loopholes, dead ends, and we keep returning at it from different angles. So as usual with these conversations, we will be discussing potentially difficult topics around harm, privilege, power. So please feel free to step back as needed, and also feel free to call on any of the three of us, me, Adam, or Anthony, via the chat if you need any support. We will follow kind of the structure we have been using in the sessions. So the session will be 90 minutes long. We will start with a Mentimeter warm-up to get a sense of the room and where we are each coming from in regards to this topic. Then we will have a Q&A dialogue between Anthony and Stephanie and Cecile to kind of surface key threads from the research and to guarantee that we have a shared ground to work from and have the dialogue, because then we will switch to a kind of fishbowl dialogue format that will explain more about how it will work when time comes. And that is the moment for you all to bring your experiences, your questions, so we can hold these questions together as a collective. And then we will come to a close. As Adam said, we will be recording the dialogue and we will stop at the group dialogue at the fishbowl for sensitivity.
Jump into to see if I can comment on that. Like,
Absolutely.
okay. So it's interesting because when we were doing the research and especially looking at the literature and also then later on engaging with reviewers, it was this notion that the fact that the onus is on those who have suffered the most, who are not in a privilege or power, that the onus is on them to take action, to change, was very prevalent. And challenging that the more powerful, privileged, those who knew the codes, who had the power to change those codes, because of their interest in the status quo, would therefore not do it. So there was kind of this binary kind of positioning of those who had the power to change things easily would not, and actually it was those who were on the receiving end of harm. The onus was on them to try to change the system.
Thank you for bringing that up, Cecile. And I think that sets up a great transition to go into the research in more detail and for Anthony to have a dialogue with both of you. Anthony, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think that's it is a good segue. So, welcome. And first of all, again, thank you for your time and effort on this. We're really excited about this conversation. Don't let my energy fool you. I'm not sleeping well. So hopefully my nerdiness will take over. So I'm going to begin with Cecile. Your background being of French descent and living in South Africa, it's fascinating to me. My own systems journey began with learning and situating Stephen Biko as a hero of mine, and especially watching the movie Cry Freedom and traveling there and all the things. How has your background, how has all of that informed your work? And perhaps more interesting, what was your inspiration for the paper, and how has it been received?
Okay. Thanks, Anthony, for that. So I'll start with, my background, because it's true. I don't think I would have written this paper, done this research if it wasn't for South Africa and for this journey to South Africa. So, I mean, I came here 20 years ago and I fell in love with the country deeply. And I, as a European, Belgian, we're not taught in school, history about Africa. Belgium colonized. I mean, some of the worst atrocities were committed by Belgium. It's glanced over in the schooling system, and so there's a lot of biases. And so even though I fell in love with the country, I came here with all my biases and the lack of understanding of what the continent really was about, and so. But I really felt home. There's a special thing about Cape Town and the mountain. I really felt home, but at the same time, it is a challenging setting. South Africa is like a microcosm of the world system, where you have everything kind of condensed in one small place. You can't hide. You can't hide from your privilege, but you also can't hide from inequalities, from environmental harm, from all of this is kind of in your face all the time. And so, this setting and some of the authors you mentioned, like Steve Biko, being exposed to that, all of that, for me created this need to question. yeah, to understand, to kind of confront my own limitations. And so I felt a lot of, so as much as I loved being here, I also was I was experiencing a lot of discomfort in being here. And I wanted to do something, but I didn't know what to do. It's like you want to do good. You want to be a good person, and you feel that you can bring, your background, your skills to the setting. So, and the first thing, but I, again, starting here was with my very strong European lens. So the first opportunity I had to kind of do something here was to work in the renewable energy sector. And it was great. I felt, I could contribute, and I felt this was going to be it, kind of. But I soon realized that there was something deeper that was troubling me. So the company was great, but basically it was just about making money. For them, whether it was clean energy or clean coal, it was the same. And so it really pushed me to kind of dig deeper and kind of question, like, why was I here? Like, what's this all about? And so I had really a deep but inarticulated problem with regards to the system. And so that led me to go back to university to do a master's in or an MPhil in sustainable development. That was a global South perspective. It was not a global North perspective, which was my training. And so it really challenged. It confronted me to with my own biases on what I thought was good, the right way, kind of to go. I don't know, a lot of things. So this kind of background really informed my work, because this program that I went on was really transformative, and it's kind of the starting point of my own journey, kind of in kind of confronting my own self. And initially through that, I started researching responsible investment. That was my research. And there was a big disconnect between what companies were doing, what they were advertising, and what was actually happening. And I had to do a lot of interviews with different people inside these companies. And I realized that it was these people inside, the change wasn't happening because it was dictated kind of, and, it wasn't a top-down thing. It was these people who intentionally, sometimes at the expense of their career, that were driving the change. And so what they brought to their workplace really mattered, and their own journey mattered. And so this led me to then decide to do my PhD and to do the research on change agents. So on these individuals, really understanding why and how they come to engage in change. So at the time, it wasn't about privilege. This came later into the paper. It was really understanding these people. And again, I wasn't maybe fully aware of my own privilege. It's something, sometimes research is a bit of a, you interact with your research and affects you. It's a journey in itself. But soon, so even though it didn't start out as looking at privilege insiders, the term, people would often say how they had to confront, they came to a point where they confronted their privilege. And this was a really important moment. You're like, okay, well, what did you think before that? Like, what was your sense around privilege? And I was like, no, I didn't feel I was privileged at all. So often there was this very strong reaction of people coming from, including in South Africa. So our research was not just in South Africa, it included other parts of the world, but it started in South Africa. And in South Africa, despite the context in which we live, most people, explained how they had this journey of confronting their privilege. They were, often for a long time, they were blind to this privilege, and it had to emerge through kind of confronting reality, questioning kind of what we unpack in the paper. And this blindness, often they would say, it's like women, for example, in the workplace would explain how, there was always more privilege than them. There was always, so this privilege was a difficult kind of concept to really kind of put boundaries around. It was intersectional. It was murky, and it was not something that was easily discussed. But in their journey, in our discussions, it became clear that this notion that we're not equal in change, like to go back to the discussion we were just having now, people who engage in change, they realize that in this fight for change, we're not equal. And often came to identify this privilege as really the lever that would allow them to go further. And now to your last point on how it was received, so Steph and I were quite intentional in sharing our findings. And so we developed guides, we developed blogs. Obviously, the embedding project was an amazing platform to share and to translate kind of our findings into kind of more accessible ways, like the guide. But also as conveners, lecturers, we also and also advisors to professionals, we could really use that to start engaging people more directly on their own journey, on their responsibility, on how they themselves could take, could take this on further. Like, how would this help them to transform? And it's been always amazing to see the reaction of people. Often when you share the diagram, they would say, "Oh, I'm here on this on the journey. I can see how this is my next step, or this is where I'm blocked." Anna, you were talking about stuckness. Often they would reflect on the stuckness and where the stuckness actually was, and therefore it kind of gave them, I think, a language or a visual understanding of what could be a possible next step, or what some of their colleagues might be experiencing, like why they weren't getting through to others. People would, say how it surfaced questions, how it helped them to question kind of their role in their business or as a global citizen, their footprint, their kind of often, it was kind of like an onion kind of way that you peel progressively. So it was a muscle that the more they engaged with the process and the model or themselves, basically, but the more they could peel and become more versed into the peeling process of and engaging with their own responsibility in change on different issues.
Oh, thank you. We'll come back to some of that. I wanted to get Stephanie's voice in. So Stephanie, can you please expand on, I think it's very subtle, but an amazing thread, the small pragmatic actions that seem to be at the heart of navigating emotional discomfort triggered by moral emotions. How does this fully square with your observations in the paper that privileged social groups are often blind to their own privilege, having little working knowledge of the advantages they enjoy or the disadvantages other groups endure, and the complexity of privilege being intersectional? I know there's a lot there. It's a really big question.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the piece, is that that people weren't universally confronting their privilege, that there were aspects of their privilege that became challenge, and that they would start to engage in as those who had a kind of the emotional fortitude to begin to actually not sort of instinctively, reactively default to narratives that they had practiced, that allowed them, and that they had internalized, that allowed them to dismiss that sense or those negative emotions, right? And so there's a whole group that don't do this, that have well rehearsed internal narratives about, why systems simply can't change, and therefore they can't be a part of changing them. But those who did start to engage with those emotions and who started to confront, I wouldn't say privilege with a capital P, but aspects of that privilege, then they would start to engage in small actions related to those aspects of that privilege. And truth be told, I think many times those are well-intentioned, but often not the right actions, because they're constrained by being only related to a particular aspect. They're initially quite contained. And so what we found is that some of those folks would start to engage in actions, and I think in many ways to make themselves feel better, and with the sense that they were going to be congratulated or thanked for these actions, and yet they were surprised when when they received not great feedback on those actions, or that when they looked around, they would realize that their actions were much smaller than they thought that they were, right? And so it would force them then into a new spiral of negative emotions and an unlayering potentially of that privilege, to realize that maybe that there were more aspects of privilege, relative privilege, that were at play here than they had initially recognized. And so this idea that it takes some turns around this loop of engaging with your emotions, confronting aspects of your privilege, engaging in actions from which you learn that that those actions weren't sufficient or weren't successful or weren't as durable or weren't as transformative as you thought that they were going to be. And I think that is important to understand, because we need these folks, and frankly, we in each in our own way are those folks. Because Cécile and I talk about, like if you've got a LinkedIn profile, essentially you're a person with privilege in some aspect. So as we start to navigate this, that there's a tension maybe for those who are wanting to support change, who are wanting to see change in organizations, but maybe have a skepticism of the intentions behind which these privileged insiders may start to engage in these actions. And there's maybe a reticence to coddle people as they go through a process like this. But that I think maybe there's a sort of something to know and understand about that gradual learning process, that that there's maybe ways to support that exploration, that in a relational way, that can be productive for helping them to move along that journey. And to me, that's something I think that would be really interesting to continue to explore. How do you actually potentially support folks to continue along this journey, as opposed to them then defaulting back to these narratives that sustain their conviction in the idea that they are not the people to help to bring about change.
No, thank you. That's very powerful. I've been bouncing back and forth and trying to pull at the nuggets, because I think you're saying something very powerful about these journeys. I would just open up to you guys to see if you wanted to say anything more about any aha moments or whatever that your research, or even a moment that you have within your research in terms of evaluating these journeys and the conditions in which these journeys take place, recognizing that how I may think of privilege, outside of an organization may be different, how privilege is thought of or exercised within an organization, and things of that nature.
I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the journey to acknowledging complicity. Another piece of it that we saw that was a pretty critical moment was around reframing of roles. And so as people began to acknowledge this complicity, those who went on to think about how they would work to transform the system, started to really give thought to how they could exercise agency within their particular roles and potentially to expand or alter or shift their roles in order to make more space for engaging in larger actions or different actions or um, putting themselves in a place where they could actually be challenging or trying to enroll others. And so I think that piece also is really interesting because it moves from kind of an internal reflection on identity into an external manifestation of that identity and that transformation of trying to actually articulate it not just as a person or a personal conviction, but actually as a shift in a professional role, I think was a really interesting part of how people took that in to try and make it more concrete in a broader system. I don't know, Cécile, if you have thoughts on
Yeah.
that.
No, I think it was a key part in how, and as you say, just translating from kind of this inner journey to how to take the agenda forward, outside with others. Also because people often did not, people often attached to their identities, their professional identities, and they remained often attached to their professional identities, but they reframed it in a way that that could bring in this kind of change agency. So it was lawyers as change makers. So it's not like people were suddenly not farmers or lawyers, but what they included in that role was very different. And yeah, so but that's really important. It's that it kind of creates these new kind of models that people can kind of look and move some kind of the abstract conversation to models that others can follow, can emulate, can or confront, and then I mean, and these are not models that are fixed because people learn over time and their own understanding of what it means to be a lawyer as a change maker, for example, evolves over time. But it's a starting point of something that feels much more, that creates these kind of alternative templates, alternative ways of being in the world that so often lack because we talk about the problems, but we don't talk about the how to create kind of aspirational identities and work.
Yeah,
I
and
think
so like many of them would take on this persona of provocateur in a way that they had previously not. And so they would say things like, if I'm not a day away from losing my job, then I'm not doing my job right, you know? And so it would sort of become part of their identity. I'm not just a lawyer, I'm a lawyer who challenges the system. I'm not just in responsible investment. I'm the person who's changing it from the inside. And so that I think was interesting because it makes it a little bit more durable and it makes it um, harder, I think, to back away from when you start framing your professional identity. And for some of these folks in a quite visible and public way, framing their professional identity in this way was almost like crossing over a threshold that would make it difficult for them to cross back. And, it's kind of a deepening of commitment that we saw that went along with that.
it makes me want to think, is there another way to express that? Because I think some of us on the other side of this show up that way naturally versus having to go through some sort of process or journey to get there. Any final thoughts before we shift to the fishbowl that you want to share with us regarding the article or some of the research or other work that you're engaged in?
Cécile?
Maybe on the work we are engaged in now, which is a bit of a question around, what happens next. It's easy, I mean, it's easy. It's one thing to observe kind of the journey of people to a certain point, but then in a difficult context, when things are not lining up, when most of our participants would say that they're swimming against the current, but now often the current is really strong, so it makes things harder. And so, yeah, we're now looking at this notion of hope and how people, what is their relationship to hope? There's often these expectations on individuals who are engaging in change within organizations or activists to kind of, hold the fort, to kind of be the people who remind us that there is still hope. But that's in certain circumstances can be quite difficult and sometimes can feel like even inappropriate at times. So yeah, so that's kind of what we are exploring now is this notion of hope in in this process.
Yeah, and there's a question in here, Cécile, about institutional repair versus institutional compliance versus transformation.
Yeah. Which means people are that will also affect their relationship to hope. But it was very important. I mean, it's an important point because in the paper and in our research, the people who are to be a change agent doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. And we really found very different people engaging with change. Those that were, positioning themselves as change makers, or change agents, but really were just complying with the system. But for them, that was change. And others who were more engaged in the small actions and tweaking the system, basically keeping kind of the boundary of the system intact. So not really challenging the status quo. And then the last group that was much more, with much more transformative action. And we found over time, so some of the people who were kind of engaged in the tweaking who are much more transformative now. So over time, they've evolved in their own journey. It's not like they're stuck in one place. But it's important to emphasize that change, and we talk about privilege and change agents and change agency. It means a lot of different things, and to a certain extent, I think with our research, there's this necessary. I mean, we highlight a certain necessity to have space for all of the different types. Even though we are trying to aim for like personally or into a more transformative agenda, but there's certain things that need to, in order to avoid kind of people raising their defense mechanisms and kind of pushing the agenda away, there's a need to kind of be to some degree accommodating to where they're at in order to help them into the next phase of questioning.
Thank you.
Which can feel frustrating, right?
Well, yeah.
To have to do this work for these people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think when you raise that level, like who are these people and the work, you lose some altruistic vision or value that's gets caught up into, the time that's dedicated to that when it could be focused into other areas. So
yeah.
Interesting. There are a couple other questions here. I don't know, Adam, would this be better in the fishbowl